Kiros report, simply speaking, is honored to do the inauguration of the Kiros report, which previously was the African Ascent first, African Ascent International later, and then Excellence towards the end. Its new name, the Kiros report, has invited Professor Michael Löwy, a French-Brazilian philosopher and sociologist, internationally renowned for numerous cutting-edge books that he has done on some of the greatest thinkers of our time and the 19th century and beyond, such as George Lukács, the Hungarian philosopher, Lucien Goldman, who was Professor Michael Löwy's dissertation advisor and mentor. Professor Löwy himself has authored phenomenal works with international acclaim on the likes of George Lukács himself, Walter Benjamin, Lucien Goldman, Che Guevara. The names are quite long, and I will have to stop listing them. And instead allot the time to discuss the content of his works. So once again, I'm honored and privileged to invite Michael Löwy to celebrate the launching of a promising television program, the Kiros Report, that I would like to consider to be the voice of the disadvantaged, the marginalized, the oppressed, and the poor of the rich of the earth, along with the intelligences, the moral compasses, the sympathies, and the compassions of the rich and powerful, so that together we can change the world and maximize as opposed to minimizing human happiness. Thanks for coming to the Kiros Report, to bless it along with the world for me, so that I can move on to make modest contributions to the amelioration, if not the radical transformation of the miserable world in which all of us are living in at the moment. Welcome to the Kiros Report, Professor Michael Löwy.
Well, thank you very much, dear Teodros, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to have this chance for an exchange with you.
All right, so what I thought we should do for the benefit of the world is for you to give us, consistent with the visions and dreams of the Kiros Report, an accurate, reliable analysis of the recent elections in France, which I'm sure you've studied with impeccable care. So give us a crash course on a short history of France and the recent declaration of what most consider to be a beacon of change for the European world and beyond it, for the kinds of alliances that need to be forged in order for radical democracies to begin taking root in the world.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we had in the last years in France a quite authoritarian government under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron, someone who pretends to be neither left nor right, but is basically a representative of neoliberal authoritarian capitalism. Now, at the recent European elections, the results were quite negative for Mr. Macron's political party. And the left parties, unfortunately, went on dispersed order. That means separately for different lists, which each got some percentage, but they were not a united body. So the force which appeared as the winner in the European elections was the far right. The far right, which is represented by the party called National Assembly or National Union, which has its roots in the fascist history of France, in the Vichy government who collaborated with the Nazis, in the colonial history of France, in the tradition of right-wing racism in France. So it has roots in the history of France in the 20th century. And it's now a very powerful force, very powerful. So they were at the head in the European election. They had around 30% of the vote. And this was part of a broader movement, of course, in Europe, of the reinforcement of far right, or what I would call neo-fascist parties. What I do call neo-fascism is parties such as this one in France, under the leadership of Marine Le Pen, and similar ones in Italy with Meloni, in Hungary with Orban, in Germany, so-called Alternative for Germany, etc., all around Europe. These far-right parties are not equivalent to the fascism of the 1930s. You don't have totalitarian states. You don't have storm troops with uniform walking in the streets. It's not the same thing. Yeah? But still, there are many elements of the fascist tradition. This ultra-right nationalism, xenophobia, racism, hostility to sexual minorities, misogynia, hatred of the left, etc., which are typical of far-right and fascist or semi-fascist, I would call neo-fascist movements. So in France, the Rassemblement National, or National Union, is one of those. Now, after this result of the European elections, the far right, the Le Pen party, the head of the list was a younger fellow called Jean Bardella. They said, since Macron party was defeated in the European elections, Macron should now call for general elections, which the leaders of Macron's party at the beginning refused. They said, this has nothing to do. This is a vote about Europe. These are European elections. These are not national elections. So there is no reason why France, the government, should dissolve the National Assembly, which was elected 2 years ago, and call for new elections, because these were European elections which are different from the national. So that was the argument, which was a reasonable argument of the leaders of Macron's political party. But surprisingly enough, Macron himself decided to dissolve the National Assembly and call for new elections. Nobody expected that. First of all, not the members of his own party. The only ones who rejoiced with this and said, yes, wonderful, was Le Pen's party, the far right, the neo-fascists. Huh? They said, wonderful, yeah, that's the thing. Yeah? And so they prepared immediately for this new election, and everybody was surprised and perplexed. Yeah? Why? Nobody couldn't understand why Emmanuel Macron dissolved the National Assembly, why they called for new election, knowing that the far right is on the rise. Did he want to give the government to the far right? What was his plan? Yeah. Probably one possible explanation is that he believed that the left would continue to be divided as they were in the European election. They would be divided, therefore weak, And the only opposition to the neo-fascists, to Le Pen's party, to the far right, would be his so-called centrist party. In fact, another version of the right. Yeah? So he probably believed that this would work. Yeah? The left would be divided, and people who didn't want Le Pen far right neo-fascist party would have to vote for his party. Yeah? But this didn't work. This didn't work for one reason, is that the left understood that they had to unite. Yeah? It was an absolute necessity if they want to survive politically, and particularly if they want to stop the rise of the far right and prevent them from governing. Yeah? Because if they would win the National Assembly elections, they could set the government. Yeah? So the left decided to unite and call for the French people to put a line, to put a resistance against the rise of neo-fascism and against the far right and against Le Pen. So this is how came about what is called the New Popular Front. We had in France a Popular Front in 1936, which was a very important event, although it had its limitations, but it was an important event which had some important results for the people, for the working class, etc. But this was a new Popular Front. And the main difference, it was composed only of left-wing parties, parties of the labor movement, while the Popular Front in 1936 included a bourgeois party, which was a radical party. Okay, now this coalition, this new Popular Front, was composed of France Insoumise, rebellious France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, which is the most radical part of the left, the most opposed to neoliberalism and who defends an ecological transition and who fights against racism, etc. So this is France Insoumise. This was the most important and most advanced part of the left, not without its problems, because Jean-Luc Mélenchon is also rather authoritarian figure. But anyhow, this was the most consistent part of the left. Next to it, the Socialist Party, which is a social democratic party, who had moved somewhat to the left during the last 1 or 2 years. Yeah? So the Socialist Party was the second force in this coalition. And then came the Green Party, the ecologists, which was much smaller. And then the Communist Party, who was the smallest of the four. Yeah? But the four united. And they united around a program which is quite advanced. The common program of the New Popular Front was a quite advanced program. It was not a revolutionary program, but it was a quite progressive program, breaking with the neoliberal policies of Macron and proposing an ecological transition and suppressing the most negative decisions taken by Macron, such as the reform of the retirement age from 62 to 64 years, which was a very regressive measure, which massively the French people opposed, but Macron imposed it by force. So the Popular Front, the New Popular Front, promised to suppress this forced change in the pension age, etc., etc. Yeah? So now what happened is that the new Popular Front was able to constitute itself and agree on a common program in only a few days, because Macron called for immediate elections. So there was no time. Yeah? But the left was sufficiently intelligent to agree that they had to come together to unite and they proposed a common slate and a common program. And in each circumscription, as we say in France, there was one candidate of the New Popular Front supported by the four parties. And in some places, the candidate belonged to the insubmissive, rebellious France Insoumise, in others to the Socialist Party, the Greens, and the Communists. Yeah? So that was the agreement. They shared the localities, the circumscriptions, and they went together, yes, to the elections. Now, what happened, to the general surprise, nobody expected it, is that the New Popular Front appeared as got most of the votes, more votes than the others, that the center, Macron's party, and the far right. And there is also the so-called Republican right, which are not fascists, but they are still very reactionary, which are a smaller part of the vote. Yeah? So the fact is that the left didn't have the majority of the National Assembly, but they had the, let's say, the largest minority. The largest minority was the coalition of the New Popular Front. So the new assembly, therefore, was very much divided. The largest group was the New Popular Front, but it didn't have the majority. The far right of Le Pen, the National Union, did have many members of parliament, but not the largest group. And the center was divided between Macron's party, which had lost a lot, and the smaller so-called Republican right wing with even smaller group. Yeah? So that was the situation.
Okay.
Now, what happened?
Yes. Now,
what happened is that the first election was to decide to choose the president of the parliament. It's a very important vote, president of the parliament. Now, what happened is that Macron, he and his party, united with the so-called Republican right. Yeah? They made a coalition. And they were the largest minority. They were larger than the left and the far right. So they elected the president of the parliament. And probably Macron would like this coalition between the center and the right to form the government. But they have many disagreements. And Macron's party also is very much divided. So it's not sure that they will come to an agreement. Yeah? Now, the left proposed a candidate for the job of prime minister because they said, we are the largest party in the parliament. So according to the tradition, the president has to call to form the government the largest party in the parliament, even if it doesn't have the absolute majority. So since the left has the largest coalition in the parliament, Macron should call one representative of this coalition for prime minister. And the left proposed, they had some difficulty in finding a common candidate for the post of prime minister, but finally they came to an agreement, and it was Lucie Castet, which is an interesting figure. She's a younger woman. She's leader of a social movement, a movement for the social services in defense of public services in France, who have been permanently being this service of health and public transport and etc., education. All public services are being dismantled by the neoliberal policies of the government. So she was the leader of a movement in defense of the public services. And she didn't belong to any political party, but she was quite leftist, quite radical, and she said, we want a clean break with the reactionary neoliberal policies of Mr. Macron and so on. Yeah? So she was speaking, but Macron refused to call her to form a government. He said, well, she doesn't have the majority in the parliament, so I can't call her. And he decided that his government, Gabriel Attal, who was the prime minister he nominated, belonging to his party, would remain until the end of the Olympic Games. Yeah? He said, well, we are in the beginning of the Olympic Games, we cannot change the government, so he will remain until mid-August, and then we shall see. So that's the situation now. The government remains the same we had before. Gabriel Attal, who is the right hand of Macron, until the end of the Olympic Games. Then we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. That was very detailed and an extraction of truth from the source. Now, pursuing the same theme, what are the implications of this for the global European political landscape, which, as you know, in the 1930s in particular, was dominated by social democratic sensibilities, a situation that was radically changed when Mitterrand took the austerity, the neoliberal program, and influenced the European landscape to also respond to the Anglo-Saxon generated obsession with neoliberal order. What are the implications of this venture in France, as incomplete as it is, as you presented, for future European movements? And most notably, for example, in England, something very similar occurred, to the surprise of the British. What are the implications of this for future global movements? Is this alliance of centers and rights and left, so forth and so on, going to be the new wave, do you think? Is this a good sign for the world, or what is it? How do you understand the situation?
Right. Look, we social scientists have trouble to understand the past and the present, but to predict the future, it's really impossible. Yeah. But anyhow, I will say a few words. The situation in France is specific, yeah, because France is the only country in Europe at the moment where the radical left, the anti-neoliberal, not to say anti-capitalist left, is the main force in the left bloc. And the left is united. Yeah? This is a unique situation in France. You don't have a similar in the other countries. Yeah? Social democracy exists in France. It had been very much weakened some 2 years ago at presidential elections. They got 2% or something like that. But they did a left turn, and thanks to this, they were able to win again some large influence, a little less than the radical left, but still. Yeah? So this is a peculiar French situation, both that the left is united and that the social democracy is not the hegemonic force of the left. While in practically all other European countries, the left is under the leadership of social democratic forces, which usually in the most of the cases are not really opposed to neoliberalism. They propose a more social version of neoliberalism, which we call social liberalism, yeah? But it doesn't break with the basic tenets of neoliberal politics, not to speak of capitalism. Yeah? This is the case in England. Yeah? In England, unfortunately, the new leadership of the Labour, Keir Starmer, is in fact very similar to what was Tony Blair's Labour Party. Yeah? A party committed to maintain the system, maintain neoliberal politics with a somewhat more social element. Yeah. So I'm afraid Keir Starmer's Labour government in England won't be a real radical change in relation to British politics. Anyhow, British politics are now separated from Europe, yeah, because of Brexit. Yeah. But still, of course, it has some connection to European politics. It's a pity because under Corbyn, yeah, the Labour Party had a much more progressive orientation, much more radical one. But unfortunately, Corbyn was defeated and he lost the elections, and the new leadership which emerged with Keir Starmer is much more reformist, much more to the center left, let's say. Yeah? And in each country, of course, the situation is different, yeah. But as I said, France is relatively an exception for the moment, yeah. In some countries, you have perhaps something similar. For instance, in Belgium, you have the Belgian Labour Party or Workers' Party, Parti des Travailleurs Belge, PTB, which is also a radical anti-neoliberal force. And they are rising, their vote is rising from election to election. Yeah? Still, the dominant force is social democracy in Belgium. Yeah? But still, this radical force, which originally came from Maoism, but they took a different orientation, can in the future perhaps become hegemony. But for the moment, they are only a hope, yeah, for the future. But in most European countries, let's take Germany, for instance. Yeah, Germany, we have a social government, which is a coalition between social democrats, Greens, and right-wing liberals. Yeah? And their policy is basically a neoliberal policy, which is not very ecological, yeah, in spite of the ecologists in the government. And so it's very disappointing. The German left, so-called left government is very disappointing. Yeah? So I don't know what will happen in Europe. The rise of the far right, of neo-fascist forces, is very worrying. In many countries, it's already in the government, in Italy, in Hungary, etc. To some extent, in Holland, there's a coalition, but they are the main force in the coalition, but also in some northern countries, Sweden or Norway, etc. So the rise of the far right in Europe is extremely worrying. And it's very sad that at the moment when the climate change and ecological crisis are obvious to everybody to see, these neo-fascist far-right parties, which are totally hostile to any ecological measure, who either deny or simply ignore the issue of climate change, they are getting so much support. This is very sad, very worrying. Yeah? But as I said, there are contradictory tendencies. The struggle will go on. I don't know what the future will be. I cannot predict the future. But for the moment, France is the only country where the left is united and the common program of the left is signaling a break with neoliberal policies.
As an authority among many other themes on George Lukács and his particular conception of the imputation of consciousness, I'm rather disturbed by the idea of the left. The term itself, the concept itself, does not seem to have any organizing principle of the kind that George Lukács and Antonio Gramsci had, named a universal consciousness rooted in the experiences, visions, and hopes of the working class. The term left in the American context is simply used without precision. And as you know, the term New Left itself is American in origin. I think it came into being and became prominent with the rise of Herbert Marcuse in the early 60s. Prior to that, there was no term called left. Now everybody uses it. And this was most prominently abused, I think, as you summarized brilliantly in French politics, this alliance between the right, the left, the center, without an organizing lens, an organizing principle, such as the maximization of human happiness through imputing universal consciousness, as George Lukács would say. So maybe you can analyze the use and abuse of the term left for me.
Well, you know, the word left has a historical origin in France. During the French Revolution, at the beginning, there was still the king. And the elected parliament, the first parliament elected in France, divided itself. The partisans of the king and of some form of constitutional monarchy were sitting on the right side. The partisans of democracy and the republic and against monarchy were sitting on the left side and on the higher side. Yeah? They called themselves also the mountain. And in the middle were those who were neither here nor there, yeah? Which were quite numerous. Yeah? They were called le marais. Yeah? They were in the middle. So that's the origin of left. The origin is synonymous with equality, freedom, and fraternity. That's which were the high values of French Revolution, with republic, a social republic, democracy, etc. And increasingly during the 19th century, it became synonymous with the labor movement. Yes, with the labor movement in its various forms, anarchism, Marxism, etc. Yeah, these were the main forces of the labor movement in the early 20th century. And then after the Russian Revolution, we had mainly social democracy and communism. Yeah? And of course, Georg Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, they were thinking about what were the strategies and the ways of organizing and fighting of the new revolutionary communist movement which emerged after the Russian Revolution. Yeah? So that was their thinking, yeah? And which is still valid today. Yeah? What Lukács and Gramsci say about the organization of the working class and working class consciousness, and Gramsci about a bloc, a coalition of the subaltern classes, the workers, the peasants, the intellectuals, etc. This all is very much relevant today. Yeah? But what we lack today is the kind of revolutionary working class parties which we had in the first years after the Russian Revolution, in the 20s. Yes? So this is what we are lacking. Now, of course, there are what we could call far left, revolutionary left, anti-capitalist left forces in Europe. They exist. Yeah? They exist. They are stronger in some countries, lesser in others. As I said, there is such a party in Belgium, which is quite strong. There is one in Portugal called the Left Bloc, which is all quite significant, etc. So in a few countries in Europe, you can find groups, parties, movements, which are somehow the inheritors of the revolutionary tradition of the labor movement, whose aim is to get rid not only of neoliberal governments, but of the capitalist system, because that's the basic issue. We know that as long as we live under the rule of the capitalist system, the issue, the subaltern classes will continue to be oppressed and exploited. Imperialism and wars will continue to exist, and the climate change crisis will get worse and worse. Yeah? So for these movements with which I identify, the issue is not only a change of government, but a revolutionary change. A revolutionary change. And for this, the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Georg Lukács, and Antonio Gramsci are very important. Very important because they give us the basic concepts, the basic elements to think about how to organize and fight for a revolutionary transformation.
Correct. And as you know, the most promising but simultaneously challenging quest that Antonio Gramsci presented is the rise of organic intellectuals, intellectuals that are directly rooted in the lives and struggles of working people to organize what you call revolutionary political parties. And if you notice, there is nothing organic, correct me otherwise, among the so-called leftist intellectuals and otherwise who speak on the behalf of the disadvantaged, the marginalized, or to be more precise, working people. What are the conditions that must be generated in order for organic intellectuals rooted in the histories and experiences of working people to come to power and organize new political parties that we don't have?
Look, there exists in Europe a network of educational and cultural foundations of the left, not a social democratic left, but a more radical left. This network is called Transform because it refers to Marx's famous phrase, philosophers said only try to understand the world, but the issue is to transform it. Yeah? So this network has foundations, it connects foundations which exist in most of the European countries. The best known of this foundation is the German Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which is associated with the Links party, the left party in Germany, which is not in government, which is in the opposition. Yeah? So these foundations, there is an equivalent in France, which is called La Boétie. It's a La Boétie Foundation, which is associated with the France Insoumise, Insoumise France. Yeah? So these foundations, they are centers where intellectuals who want to be related to the left movements, to the left parties, the left organizations, the left currents in the unions, etc., try to participate. Yeah? And I think they have a positive role. For instance, in France, this La Boétie Institute, where I myself take part, has just issued a very important book which many intellectuals participated, many radical, most maybe Marxist intellectuals participate, about what is the new fascist right? What is the new right, far right threat? Why does it exist? What are its main characteristics? And how can we fight it? Yeah? It's a very important contribution. Yeah? It's a collective of intellectuals who work to publish this book. Yeah? So I think these are important contributions, of course, and these are some modest attempts, let's say, to do something in the spirit of what Gramsci would call organic intellect.
Correct. And now, as we are approaching the end, and of course, this is only the beginning for us. If you have time, I'm going to invite you to come once a year, and I would like you to become the analytic voice of mm, European experiences, and I would like you to come every year and give us a report, as you just did on the French elections. That is my plan, once a year. In the meantime, your expertise that are manifest in the numerous works that you've done on brilliant thinkers includes an interest in surrealism through your work on Walter Benjamin. What do you think are some of the useful implications of surrealism that we can use to develop new political parties? What can we extract from these realistic sensibilities to bring in to the world a sensibility of organizing human beings through the expression of their freedom and happiness, which is what the surrealists, and you more than anybody else knows this, were fundamentally interested in? How can we use the idea of surrealism to help us to transform the world?
Well, the surrealist movement, which was a cultural, political, revolutionary movement of artists, poets, intellectuals, didn't have any intention of organizing people, of building political parties. That was not their aim. Their aim, their activity was mainly cultural, but it was very political. Some of the surrealists belonged to political parties. Yeah? For some time, in France, for instance, they joined the Communist Party. Then they broke with the Communist Party, and they were linked to Leon Trotsky. And Breton, the leader of the surrealist movement, went to Mexico in 1938 and met with Leon Trotsky. And they published together a very important document on revolutionary art, what could be an independent revolutionary art. Very important cultural document. And later, after the war, the surrealists became connected for some time with the anarchists in France, etc. Yeah? And during all these years, they were always active in anti-colonial movements, yeah? Because they believed that the people who lived in the peripheries, yeah, who lived in the so-called third world countries, or the countries of the South, the colonized countries, their cultures, their way of living were much more authentic than the capitalist civilization, the capitalist Western civilization. Yeah? So they always supported the colonial people in their struggle against the colonizers, the imperialists, who wanted to impose capitalist civilization, the commodity, the world of commodity, and so on. Yeah? So they were active anti-colonialists during all their history. So surrealism is mainly a movement of rebellion in the name of freedom. That's the main value of surrealism, is freedom, and a poetical relation to nature and to other human beings, and of course, love. Yeah, love is a basic value of the surrealist movement. Yeah? So surrealism can bring a revolutionary, insurrectionary values and feelings and aspirations. Yeah? It is a cultural movement which aims at a global transformation of society, of culture, of the spirit, against the established order, against the Western capitalist civilization. But it's not a organized political movement. It's a cultural subversive movement which expressed itself in political and philosophical statements, in poetry, in art, in paintings, in cinema, films, etc. Yes. So it was basically a subversive, insurrectionary, revolutionary cultural movement. That's the spirit of surrealism, and it's still alive. Yeah, we have surrealist movements today in many countries, in France, in Brazil, in United States, etc. So it's something still very much alive, and I think it's an important cultural contribution to a new way of looking at the world. Yeah, and we know, as Gramsci always explained, that culture is essential in the struggle for transforming society. Yeah, without a revolutionary culture, there can be no revolutionary change.
Incredible. And of course, I'm going to save this last question that I'm going to ask for the future so that you can come back and devote an entire episode to it. But let me just ask it so that you can give us a few insights. As a French, Brazilian, and Marxist philosopher and sociologist, your mastery of French elections, I'm sure, extends to that of Brazil also. Any words on Brazil? Is there anything that you would like to say about Brazil, future promises and future challenges for my viewers?
Yeah. Well, Brazil went in the last years through a very, very negative experience. We had during 4 years a real neo-fascist government under Bolsonaro. So a military who was an admirer of the military dictatorship, who was an admirer of the worst torturers of the military dictatorship, and who would like to establish a fascist regime in Brazil, but he couldn't. But it took many, many negative policies. I cannot go into details, it would take 1 hour. Among them, destruction of the Amazonian forest, because he gave the green light to the landowners, cattle raisers and soya growers, etc., to go on, destroy the forest, expel the indigenous population, and use the land for your agro business. Yeah? That was his politics. Now, fortunately, 2 years ago, people decided it was enough, and they voted for Lula of the Workers' Party, who represented the opposition. And he won by a small difference. So there's still a large section of the Brazilian population which identified with this far-right neo-fascist Bolsonaro, something which is very, very worrying. Now, Lula's government, Lula is not a revolutionary. He is a progressive leader, come from the labor movement, and he has some proposals which are progressive, but he is not going, he doesn't have politics of changing the system. But even his more progressive politics, he has trouble to implement them because he doesn't control the parliament. The parliament is in the hands of the right and the far right. The governors of many of the main republics inside Brazil, the states, are in the hands of the right and even of the far right. The police and the army, of course, are on the right side, and so on. So his position is not very easy. He has been trying to implement some progressive measures, but he has made too many concessions to the right wing, so it's not an easy position. Now, there exists in Brazil a more radical force, which is an anti-capitalist movement, which is called the Party of Socialism and Freedom. And they have an important group of members of parliament, and many women, young women, some of them of African origin. So it's important for us. They have a position of giving critical support to Lula against the right, against the fascists, but at the same criticizing the limits of his politics and proposing a more radical orientation. The main leader of this party is called Jorge Bulos. he's the leader of an important social movement in Brazil, the homeless people's movement of people in the main towns which fight for having a house to live or an apartment, something, and which imposed by their struggle oblige the government to building houses for them. Yeah? It's a very important movement. And George Boulos is also the main leader of the PSOL, the Party of Socialism and Freedom, and he is now candidate to be the mayor of São Paulo, which is the main town in Brazil. And he may perhaps win the mayorship of São Paulo. We will see in the next few months. Yeah?
Excellent.
So that's the situation in Brazil, to make short, because it will need another hour.
That's what we're going to do. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to devote an entire hour to the analysis of Latin America in general, with a focus on Brazil, because you happen to be partly of a Brazilian origin, and you were also born in Sao Paulo. So I took an opportunity to extract some insights from you. Well, Kiros' report is simply honored, privileged, and elated to have celebrated its inauguration with the renowned Marxist scholar, thinker, writer, and activist, Professor Michael Löwy. Thank you so much for coming to the Kiros report, and I hope that you're going to become one of its pillars. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to have this dialogue with you.
Thank you. And my viewers, I'm now on a Patreon and YouTube. Please subscribe so that with your help, I'll contribute to the development of a powerful, authentic program that will bring to you perspectives that simply are not available in the dominant media. Thank you so much.